For all of my gushing about the Fullmetal Alchemist manga in the previous breakdowns, I must admit that the first couple of chapters following what I view as the opening act are not the strongest. And really, cracks were showing as early as Dr. Marco quite literally strolling into the plot. This is a common grievance people have with the early manga, which 2003 manages to skate around through numerous changes to its timeline, many of which are impossible to translate, as we also discussed last time. In any case, this entire section of Ed and Alan Central, after the repairs in Resin Bowl, is the weakest arc in the entire manga. This isn't to say it's bad, but rather, by the numbers. The initial hunt for Marco's notes, while admittedly over pretty quickly, comes off as padding in the end for how easily the brothers end up sidestepping it. I don't mind Jessica as a character, but her inexplicable ability to solve this major hurdle for the brothers is totally unearned. Really though, Sheska being a deus ex machina is ultimately a small problem given how much the brothers will still have to do to find the truth of Marco's research. No, my main problem with this stretch of material has to do with these two. Maria Ross and Danny Brosh take Armstrong's place in the narrative for this part of the story, and frankly, I don't know why. They really don't do anything, with Arakawa going as far as to bring Armstrong back for the one plot-relevant moment they could have been instrumental in. Yes, they are occasionally good at comic relief, but having them both be this one note just feels like missed potential. Hell, the unnamed librarian is more important to the plot than these two in the manga. And regarding Armstrong being brought back, Arakawa uses him to diffuse tension. I get it, Fullmetal Alchemist can be funny, and that is an intentional and even important facet of its writing. But this is not how to do it. This revelation deserves a moment of reflection and to be treated with tact. It doesn't deserve to be arbitrarily hand-waved away by the most over-the-top character in this story. Things do pick up quickly once Ed and Al are back on their feet, with the Lab 5 entry, the battle with the guards, and the eventual first meeting of Ed and the homunculi all being solid. This is, of course, except for this one bit with Barry the Chopper that snowballs into the FMA manga's worst arc. But I think it's best we put a pin in that for now. Following that plotline's resolution, the brothers and Winray depart for Rush Valley and Doubleth, while Hughes... Wow, we're already here, huh? A common criticism of Brotherhood is its handling of Hughes compared to the 2003 adaptation, but I would advise folks blaming Brotherhood for that decision to look at how the manga treats him. Hughes is only around for 15 of the 108 chapters that make up Fullmetal Alchemist, and since he doesn't appear at all in the first 4 chapters, instead making his first appearance in a bonus chapter following them, Hughes is only around for around 11 of the 108 chapters. This exceedingly limited time with Hughes leads to this scene coming off less as an, oh, this character I've become so attached to has just been killed, and more of an, oh, this character I was expecting to learn more about has just been killed. While there's nothing necessarily wrong with this, I don't think I'm breaking new ground when I say the former would have been preferable. I skated around it up to this point in the video, but I think it's time to bring up how 2003 made nearly all of these story beats better. Sheska, foreshadowed in previous material. Maria Ross, now a fully faceted character who pushes back on Ed in a way that feels very realistic and doesn't remove tension. Barry the Chop, okay, 2003 actually made this one a little worse when it had everything it needed to make it better, but that's a subject for another breakdown. The plotline that follows, significantly better built up to by making Al more gullible and childish than Ed. Hughes' death, directed masterfully, with a longer build-up that makes his passing have a much greater impact on the story, even if the new circumstances for why this material even happens are highly questionable. It's only when we hit Rush Valley that this dynamic changes, but for now the questions laid before us are clear. How many of 2003's improvements can be incorporated into Brotherhood? And what deviations should be made from all official versions to get the most out of this material? With these in mind, let's head into FMABR, Episode 7. You'll notice that I didn't bring up Brotherhood much at all in the last segment, and that's mostly because I only have one manga deviation on its part to speak of for this entire stretch of the story, and it's right at the beginning. For official Episode 7, Hidden Truths, the first scene that isn't a recap is this very silly close-up shot of Ed's face before we cut to the ruins of Central Library. This is a notable deviation as it's further removed from the manga than 2003 is for this particular moment. It also isn't funny. And unlike some later events we'll cover, the manga seems to agree. As for why Brotherhood chose to do this, I posit the intent was some sort of wink and a nod to viewers who already knew this was coming up because they'd either read the manga or watched 2003. It's the only way I can make sense of this particular example. All this made choosing the start of this episode for FMABR quite easy, though I did elect to quickly move on from it by maintaining the cut used to keep Brotherhood's timelines of events intact here. Following the explosion that concludes the homunculi's ambush of Scar in the sewers, we get a pretty heavily cut version of Brotherhood's follow-up scene with the Mustang unit. This scene ended up being a real piece of work, mostly because of a snippet of dialogue from Maria Ross from the start of the episode.
We've informed the Major that Scar has been spotted around Central again, and he's specifically targeted you in the past.
To get this line to work, which is already dubious but far from unbelievable given the several days the bros were away, we have to remove this opening bit from Hawkeye saying that
Scar hasn't been sighted. Not once since that incident with the Elric brothers.
Which itself is a little questionable given how long it's been. Instead, a section from a later clip of a guard running to Mustang's office is looped before cutting to a now first line from Havoc. Mustang's follow-up was also cut down, but this was less due to continuity and more to directorial preference on my part. In the original scene, both in Brotherhood and the manga, Mustang admits his ambition to become the Führer of Amestris for the first time to the audience. I don't like it. Bear in mind that this ambition is restated a bit more poetically just a couple of episodes later through a flashback, which in hindsight makes this reveal seem rather premature. It's also worth noting that 2003's choice to reveal this earlier was built on an entirely different context we cannot carry over. Back to this cut, clipping this bit out required some panning trickery, but ultimately it fit together without being too disjointed. Following this scene, we cut straight to Ed, Al, Ross, and Brosh in the car heading to Sheska's house. This is one of only 2 scenes with Maria Ross that wasn't taken from 2003, and that's thanks to this scene being a rare example of Brotherhood giving Maria Ross more agency than she had in both prior versions. Remember, it's the unnamed librarian that gives the brothers this information there. Combine this with 2003's take on the group getting this information using context from a now non-existent flashback arc, and this was a no-brainer. It only helps that this bit between the 4 has always stuck out to me as one of the few jokes I like from this section. Once we arrive at Sheska's house, I like to use 2003's establishing shot and break-in scene to further sow the seeds of Ross and Ed's dynamic. Once we're inside the house, however, I switch back to Brotherhood's take on the group digging Sheska out and learning more about her ability. This is a pretty ideal sequence to bring up the variable of variety and its impacts on my directorial decisions for FMABR. Remember, FMABR is part of a matched set, so I'm expecting people to watch quite literally the exact same scene twice with different context anytime that I use 2003 footage in FMABR, with one exception that we'll get to in a bit. So, in examples like this where I slightly prefer how 2003 handled the material, I can nonetheless appreciate what Brotherhood did enough that I'll let it keep its version for the sake of variety. And so, the only shot changes during this portion were to keep Sheska's house consistent with its 2003 appearance, which coincidentally matches the manga better than Brotherhood does anyway. This is as good a time as any to mention that this is also true of Hughes' house between versions. In all honesty, I think Brotherhood's change to less identifiable, more brutalist and fascist architecture was a smart change on its part that helped to sustain a subtle air of menace to Central City specifically. However, since an earlier and later scene I'm quite fond of rely on Sheska's house looking the way it does in the manga in 2003, I was compelled to veto Brotherhood's design change in this example. After this sliding transition, we change back to 2003 for the sake of later scenes with Ross and Ed that they're connected to. In the manga and Brotherhood, it's Ross who stays behind with Sheska to take care of payment, while 2003 chooses to have Ross hand this off to Brosh while she goes to confront Ed about his recklessness. Again, great character work here. And these moments with Ross just keep rolling with her watching over the brothers while they research. It should be noted that Brotherhood's equivalent scene here with the brothers and Brosh is solid, but the show-don't-tell attitude combined with the small character moments made 2003 the standout choice. The Mahjahal cameo and Alchemy technobabble just weren't enough to win Brotherhood the spot this time. We do get a chance to move back to Broho right after the music cuts though, even if it's very short-lived and exists to work around Ed's line about Marco being in the Führer's custody, a 2003 only plot point. Once Hughes enters the room, we promptly switch back to 2003 so we can get another handful of fantastic 2003 original interactions. And in the following scene, this is only further emboldened by a sharper choice of music. Lowart pointed this out in his coverage, but I feel the need to reiterate just how limited Brotherhood's score was in these early episodes. I'm not sure why it's like this given how much music they theoretically had to pull from, but it meant that the already more grounded 2003 score ended up soaring in these scenes in a way that Brotherhood just can't compete with yet. Following Sheska's hiring, we have another one of my favorite scenes in any form of FMA in this conversation between Ross and Hughes. It's a remarkable bit of character work, and it's wild to me that it's remained stuck in the 2003 series until now. While the scene initially transitioned into the second half of a Scar fight that's 2003 only, we instead fade out and cut straight to Ed discovering the truth of Marco's research. Again, this was done with 2003 footage so that only Maria Ross picks up on this. It also made for a much cleaner end to the episode as opposed to official episode 7, which oddly continues from this point to a cliffhanger of Ed and Al making their way through Lab 5. While ending earlier results in the second shortest episode in all of FMABR at about 18 minutes, I still consider it a vast improvement over the official episode 7 in all paralleled scenes. It should be noted that the official runtime when strictly comparing paralleled scenes comes out to 16.5 minutes. As for material that wasn't paralleled, we'll have to look at the following episode. Episode 8's opening is an all-time favorite for me. The shot of the hand reaching up from the broken alchemy tablet happens to be adapted from the manga's opening page for its equivalent chapter. I've used it extensively in FMABR promo material as it's always been a striking piece of art to me. The 2003 episode continues past this shot, in Al's monologue, to where the cast was at the end of the previous. And yes, that means more of 2003 dominating the cut, at least for now. Short of the title card pasted over the start of 2003's first OP scene, 2003 continues to run the show for about a quarter of the runtime. This includes Armstrong getting a brief moment of levity, but ultimately being turned away. Again, this is a manga deviation, but one well worth indulging in. It also includes Ed and Al arguing about their findings and Ed accidentally swiping the cup at Al. If you saw earlier releases of this scene, you'd know that FMABR used to have this sequence truncated. I felt the scene came off as excessively melodramatic and thus totally dissonant in the opposite fashion of its manga counterpart. Despite this, I elected to keep it in the most recent build for 2 reasons. 1. Continuity. Without the cup, Ross doesn't really have any reason to barge in. And 2. Al punches Ed twice in episode 5 in an overreaction of his own. At worst, they're even now. Ultimately, the cup is just a setup for another 2003 exclusive element, this one wildly more important. Ross's conversation with Ed. I love this scene. The music, the delivery in both sub and dub, the subtle but effective use of animation. It's outstanding stuff that deserves to be in both canons. Shortly after this scene, though, I chose to cut back to Brotherhood by having the 4 go to Armstrong upon this revelation from Ed. There is part of me that really wishes I could have had this interaction with Ross somehow covering for the white lie she told Armstrong earlier, now that they need his help, but I don't have the means to make that happen, sadly. Starting with this scene of Armstrong explaining the alchemy lab situation, Brotherhood takes the wheel for a bit. This is mostly thanks to the scolding from Armstrong and the initial trespassing into Lab 5 being covered in satisfactory fashion. Once Ed makes his way into Lab 5 proper, however, we get a unique moment for FMABR, a footage swap. Unlike every other change made to FMABR, the Lab 5 break-in was done better in 2003 for a manga broho context, while the manga and Brotherhood's more straightforward setup suits the 2003 version better. So, in an odd twist, the two have found themselves completely flipped around. The sequence cuts off just before the 2003 only appearance of Greek can make its way in, with the return to Brotherhood footage of Al waiting on Ed now taking its place. From here, Brotherhood gets to take the wheel for the remaining episode, but with one major caveat: Barry the Chopper's characterization. While there's nothing I can do about Barry being almost pure comedy relief when he reappears in the story, I did want to at least make his introduction maintain an air of menace. Through some careful retiming in the edit, I was able to do just that. Following this edit, I elected to make another key deviation regarding Barry that I've danced around up to this point. No more created memories lie. Let's get this out of the way. The concept of whether Al believes his soul is real, or if he believes he's simply made up of fragmented memories his brother had of him when he was alive, could have been a spectacular arc. It could have delved into what differentiates the two conceptually, what thoughts he was wrestling with, what aspects of normal human life he could still remember well. A lot of great stuff. This is not what we got. Instead, Al goes off the deep end and assumes that Alphonse Elric, a real kid with photographic evidence proving his existence, was not only never real, but a vanity project of Ed's that everyone goes along with for some reason. And look, I get it, Alphonse is a 14-year-old kid in an extremely traumatic situation. It's not unbelievable for him to come to some wacky conclusions given the mental strain this body has on him. However, we're also shown that Al is one of the most talented alchemists in the country full stop, that he keeps up with Ed at every turn both mentally and physically up to this point, and that he's even expressed humility regarding his position on a handful of occasions. We've also seen him act with a greater level-headedness and skepticism than his brother. He even displays a greater sense of determination when things get particularly tough. Then Barry, a known psychopathic serial killer, brings up this concept to him, and Al just casually falls for it hook, line, and sinker. Yes, Barry is the first person Al meets in a similar condition to his own, and that does give Barry a little more credence, but his rationale for his own soul is noticeably half-baked, and should be enough for Al to dismiss what he's saying. Again, if Al had reflected on this and come to a far more plausible version of Barry's argument after the fact, the setup still could have worked. Again, though, that isn't what we got. Lowart put it best in his coverage of this plotline, but the manga's take on the story was never really about Al or delving into his character. Instead, this whole arc was a Trojan horse for delving into Winry's character. We get a whole host of great moments with her and Hughes during this section, only some of which hinge on the Identity Crisis plotline even being here. So, I decided to cut the plotline altogether from FMABR. If it's any consolation to those who enjoyed some of the scenes I cut from this arc, some of them will make it into FMA 3R for reasons best left to a separate discussion. Back to the episode at hand, we come to a change that may have been done regardless of whether this plotline had been cut. Kembley's flashback is now tied to Scar's. Since the original transition to this scene no longer applies, I decided to just fade it through Kembley's reminiscence during the Lab 5 explosion. It's not the cleanest cut ever, but it flows well enough. At the very least, it's better than my earlier attempts that threw this scene at the end of Miracle at Rush Valley. I also glossed over it at the end of the previous episode, but 2003 had its take on Scar waking up occur alongside those ending scenes of Ed's discovery of the truth. The 2003 team elected to give Scar a role in the Lab 5 arc, mandating him heal much quicker from lesser injuries so he could muscle his way back into the plot. This is a trick they would pull again with Major Armstrong later on, but I'm getting ahead of myself. While I have no issue with 2003 doing this for its story, the manga and Broho make it very clear that Scar is firmly out of the picture for the time being. Having him heal up so quickly would damage this setup. So, it ended up here. The scene with Scar now concludes the episode, bringing us to episode 9, Created Feelings. Separate Destinations. Yeah, it turns out these two open spots I mentioned in the last video regarding episodes 2 through 4 have come back to bite us. While we did end up with 2 spaces through moving First Day's contents back and demoting official episode 1, First Day still needs a place to go. If it's moving to episode 12, which it is, that means we either have to deal with the domino effect for every single episode after it, not gonna work, demote some other episodes in the same fashion as official episode 1, no material qualifies for this, or combine the contents of 2 episodes together at some point so it all resyncs by the end. And since Created Feelings doesn't even make sense as a title anymore, it and Separate Destinations were the obvious candidates for combined content. This does still cause a limited domino effect, however, as episodes 11 and 12 of the official cut have been moved back 1 spot. It's simply put to a stop once we resync with the official numbers at new episode 12. Before we get into episode 9 itself, though, I'm afraid we need to take a bit of a detour to help cover some of the bonus chapters that are on the horizon. So the manga had these things called bonus chapters, right? These were occasionally released alongside new manga chapters and inhabit a weird state regarding manga canonicity and adaptation into anime. Of the 17 bonus chapters, 3 were thinly veiled advertisements for then-current video games, 1 was a piece of promotional material for Fullmetal Alchemist 2017, 5 were adapted and combined into 2 full episodes of the 2003 anime, 4 were adapted into Brotherhood as OVAs, 3 were never adapted into either anime, and 1 was Fullmetal Alchemist, the prototype, an early draft of what would later become the Lior plotline of Fullmetal Alchemist. It should be acknowledged that these bonus chapters were not always included as part of the manga itself. FMA the Prototype was released for the 1-year anniversary of the manga's completion, Fullmetal Alchemist 0 was a Japanese-only promotional bonus for theatergoers of the 2017 film, The Phantom of Warehouse 13 was a bonus chapter not from the manga itself, but from the first FMA light novel, The Land of Sand, which also got adapted into a 2-parter of its own in the 2003 anime, oddly enough, and The Blind Alchemist and Long Night are exclusive to Fullmetal Alchemist Perfect Guidebooks 1 and 3 respectively, for some reason. And 2 of them were from action figures? Am I reading this right? Anyways, the shenanigans don't stop there, because determining where these fit in the timeline is an even bigger challenge than just finding all of these things. While the prototype and video game tie-in bonus chapters are unambiguously non-canon, Fullmetal Alchemist 0, aka The Journey Begins, arguably is. I only say arguably because I could only find the first page of it, and I don't see any immediate contradictions to it being canon. Bonus story, The Phantom of Warehouse 13, is of dubious canonicity since it's attached to a light novel of dubious canonicity. but otherwise, it doesn't cause any obvious problems if it's set sometime during or before the Wish Fulfillment chapters. Similarly, his Battlefield Once More, Tales of the Master, Short Story, Long Night, The Military Festival, The Blind Alchemist, and Simple People all work just fine on the basis that they take place before Lior, even if the exact time frame they take place in is occasionally murky. Another Journey's End acts on similar grounds, albeit taking place after the contents of the main series as opposed to before. It's when we get to the last three that things get interesting. Dog of the Military can take place anywhere from Lior to Black Coyote's first appearance on the opening page of Chapter 31, the chapter where Barry the Chopper reappears and the Elrics depart from Dubleth. Roy Mustang's observation diary could similarly take place within a wide range of time, effectively functioning any time from before Lior to the Maria Ross hoax, with the latter limitation only existing due to Gene Havoc being out of commission following that arc. And last but not least, we have the Second Lieutenant Goes to Battle. This chapter can't go anywhere. Based off of Havoc's initial dialogue, this chapter takes place after Mustang's unit has moved to Central, but before Major Armstrong went with Bradley to assist in the raid on the Devil's Nest. This is a point in time that does not exist, something Brotherhood makes clear through an anime original scene with Roy and the Führer's secretary. No, not that one, this one. Even if we grant that it takes place after Armstrong recovers from said injuries, Havoc is already a paraplegic by that point. There is no time when these two characters are both in Central and both look like this. It's a very small oversight and totally forgivable when you keep in mind that the story is just a small bonus feature. It would only be a problem if you were trying to incorporate this bonus chapter directly as part of a greater narrative. Oh. This is where adaptation acts as the last layer of mud to wade through on this. While Brotherhood sorts this out by making its handful of these sequences OVAs, albeit ones that aren't very clear on when they should be watched as part of the main series run, 2003 elected to take a handful of bonus chapters and work them all into its own canon. And since these are the only adaptations of these stories, they were the only versions I could work with for FMABR. The episodes of 2003 that use these elements are Fullmetal vs. Flame and The Flame Alchemist, respectively. And in both cases, several 2003 exclusive plot beats are baked into the story. Fullmetal vs. Flame has this the worst, as the entire reason behind Ed and Mustang fighting is changed to a 2003 exclusive goal: get information from Mustang about Dr. Marco. Without this goal, the story doesn't have an ending. I did try to rig one up with the existing footage, but video as a medium just doesn't do as well with these sorts of abrupt conclusions the way manga does. It doesn't help that 2003's take on the fight's conclusion ends with a very serious insight into just how harrowing the Ishval War was, meaning that ending on a gag immediately after is ill-fitting to say the least. Dog of the Military fares a little better, but not enough to work since Mustang's entire bit is tied into the mock battle exam. While keeping them combined and turning them into a bonus episode almost works, so much so that I might release the unfinished version of it I've got kicking around, the entire tone of this fight and the way Ed and Mustang interact with each other just doesn't gel with the duo we'll see in episode 4. If I had the tools to do whatever I wanted to make all this fit, I would have combined these two side stories with the Tucker arc in Brotherhood. Have Nina in the stands cheering Ed on, kinda like she was during Ed's original alchemy exam in 2003. After all, assessment day's coming up. It would only make sense for Ed's exam to be on the table at the same time, right? I get that this would have been a manga deviation, and that official Brotherhood had enough problems before trying to take something like this on, but it's what I would have employed given the tools to make it happen. Given that the setup is a pipe dream, this entire section of the story did not make it into FMABR. The Flame Alchemist, on the other hand, I can work with, if only by fudging the rules. For 2003, that whole bit about Havoc and Armstrong never being in the same place in fit condition, yeah, Armstrong doesn't end up nearly as injured, so they skirt that problem completely. And before anyone says it, no, I couldn't take this retcon for myself. There are too many scenes that are manga broho only, with Armstrong still bandaged up. Anyway, through eliminating this discrepancy, 2003 has a pretty easy time combining Roy Mustang's observation diary, The Second Lieutenant Goes to Battle, and The Phantom of Warehouse 13 into a single episode. Albeit with some 2003 exclusive setup for the next arc peppered in. And the real kicker? The Mustang unit being in Central during all this time is never brought up short of a newspaper. This means we can recontextualize this material to take place while Mustang's unit is still at Eastern Command, freeing up this entire stretch for possible spots to throw these stories in. Unfortunately, even this isn't quite as much leeway as it seems. To start, episodes 1 through 4 are too early for this material. Remember, this entire early section is meant to keep the illusion of the world being small, with little in the way of recurring characters. Putting too much focus on these guys too early could easily damage that carefully constructed facade. For episodes 5, 6, 7, and 8, though, everyone's too busy. In 5, Armstrong is busy helping Hughes with the Scar investigation. In 6, he's lugging Alphonse across the east until his body can be reassembled. In 7, just as Armstrong gets a waft of freedom to be used in other plot points, the Scar matter reopens in the east, with Havoc being very explicitly tied up until the end of Episode 8. This means Episode 9 is the absolute earliest this material could go, and I snatched that opportunity up the moment I realized it was there. That isn't to say I did it quickly, however, as this sequence was a pretty recent addition all things considered. Whoops. Anyways, tangent over. On to the episode. We open with the war flashback that starts official Episode 10. As stated earlier, this now acts as the first time the audience has shown the extent of Mustang's ambition, both more poetically and with clarity. Following the OP, we open with the 2003 take on Ed waking up after Lab 5. This acts as the last major example of 2003 original characterization for Maria Ross. While the scene isn't quite as changed from its manga counterpart as the previous ones, the subtle change in character dynamics and the sense of authority Ross acts on still makes it a clear winner. I did have to cut it down slightly, however, as Ross's flashback to the night before involves a scene exclusive to the 2003 anime. I also had to cut out most shots of Al from this portion, as 2003's take on Lab 5 left him in much worse shape than it did in the other versions. Instead of transitioning straight to Winry's house, though, we now J-cut to the Mustang unit discussing Havoc's new assignment to spy on Mustang for internal affairs. While the original punchline from the manga is lost to this adaptation can tie into the following one, the new punchline is still top tier and more than worth using. After this, we finally cut back to Brotherhood's take on Ed calling Winry about repairs. This is a little cut short since this line from Brosh undercuts a better one from Hughes later. Between this and some cut material from the Created Feelings plotline, we now cut directly to Winry meeting Armstrong at Central Station. Both 2003 and Brotherhood do a good job with this, so I went with Brotherhood on this occasion. Following their arrival at the hospital, we have another cut. Winry doesn't rescind her apology about the screw. Lower already made a pretty solid case for why this ruins what's otherwise a pretty great little moment, and I can't help but agree with him on this. 2003 does this scene better than its counterparts, but I still think it works better without it even there. It also makes for a good excuse to cut more of Al being angsty. We pretty cleanly move between the now cut gag and enjoy Hughes' first appearance of the episode. Well, besides the flashback, anyway. Hughes' escapades with Winry still go pretty much unimpacted, as while the line about something bothering Al doesn't refer to something specific to him anymore, it functions when you consider the truth of the stone is still something the brothers are left to grapple with. After Hughes and Winry set off the following day, we cut back to Havoc's plotline for a bit to set up Fullmetal's search. Though this search is now off-screen since 2003's setup wasn't workable, having the rest of the episode play out as it does helps alleviate this. Upon cutting back to Brotherhood, we're now done with the content from official episode 9, and instead move on to content from official separate destinations. This material goes entirely uncut for some time, only having 2003 material spliced in after the gag about Ed and Al's teacher. There's certainly an argument to be made that 2003's take on these scenes is better directed, but the post-Lab 5 content is where its deviations really start to pile up. This is material that, while ostensibly similar, has become too different in function to gel with the manga Brotherhood tone by this point. This isn't to indicate a decline of 2003 use overall though, far from it. In fact, it's just an acknowledgement that the rift between canons is growing as we get further in. Back to the episode, we J-cut again to Mustang hearing out Fullmetal's findings. From here, the adaptation of the second lieutenant goes to battle goes off without a hitch. The only cut was a very small moment of Armstrong giving a memo to Havoc intended for Mustang, yet another 2003 exclusive plot point. We then cut back to Brotherhood with Hughes researching the Lior incident. This continues unabated until the 30-minute mark. I'd already used both sets of bumpers by this point in the episode, and a simple fade-out, fade-in wasn't really cutting it for me, so I came up with these. It's nothing crazy, but it gives the audience just a little more time to process what just happened before the funeral scene comes in. It should be noted that the official cut goes for a subversion here by cutting to Ed, Al, and Winry on the train to Rush Valley. While this works, we'll see why I didn't go with it in just a second. As the Brotherhood version of the funeral scene runs its course, we cut away from it right when the time of day changes and Mustang's monologue begins. I have no doubt that this call will be one of the most controversial I make in all of FMABR. It is a bold, perhaps even insane choice to cut the single most meme scene in all of FMA, but I had to do it. For anyone questioning this, I ask you to watch these scenes back to back, ideally dubbed where you can really tell how different the voice direction was. Travis Willingham is great in both shows, but it's moments like this where his more subdued, realistic performance lands so much harder. I also appreciate that Hawkeye immediately understands the terrible day for Rain line, a subtle change that I think adds a lot to their dynamic irrespective which canon it applies to. The scene also carries over the track Requiem for the Brigadier General, which just ups the ante even more as it creates a chilling chordioid with the opening arpeggio of the following track, an arrangement of Brothers. I don't just bring up music here for the fun crossfade, however. I bring it up because this is the only time in all of FMABR where any version of Brothers plays. It's the cornerstone of the 2003 soundtrack, and easily the greatest piece of music FMA has ever received, so much so that it just felt wrong to use it in Brotherhood. It feels written very directly for these brothers, not these brothers, if that makes any sense. However, I was willing to make one exception here, not only because the music is perfect in this scene, but also because it now acts not as a theme for these brothers, but as a farewell theme for Hughes. With this recontextualization in mind, I made my peace with its appearance here, and the scene speaks for itself. We then round out to a custom credit sequence exclusive to this episode and based off of 2003's custom ending for episode 25. The only downside to this approach was the cutting of the Flame Alchemist's last adaptation, The Phantom of Warehouse 13. There was no contraindication to this being canon to FMABR, but there just wasn't any more room in episode 9. I needed at least one scene to buffer between these two stories, and I was fresh out by this point in the episode. The potential hit to the episode's pacing only further made me decide against its inclusion. This does hurt a fair bit, as this chapter is probably the funniest of the bunch, but I suppose it just makes for one more reason to still watch FMA 3R when it comes out. I should also note that all material taken from The Flame Alchemist now fulfills a different purpose here than it did in 2003, and even the manga to some extent. These stories don't just act as quick bits of levity in an increasingly serious story. They remind the audience that despite the horrible events these characters have endured, it's possible to still have fun, to be silly and/or goofy. This message resonates with me a lot, but it's also much more important to the 2003 anime, a series that will range almost exclusively between starkly depressing and bittersweet from here on out, than it is to the manga, a canon that will never really lose its optimism nor its idealism. Instead of all that, FMABR makes these stories act as a bit of subversion, much like the wish fulfillment chapters of the early manga were. Throughout the episode, every single moment that could have been used to build tension ends up played for laughs or diffused relatively peacefully. It doesn't hold any animosity towards Maria Ross after their conversation, or vice versa. Winry's mistake with the automail is swiftly rectified. Vera Bradley's visit ends up being one of Brotherhood's best comedic bits rather than a massive escalation of the story like it could have been. Even the Elrics meeting up with their teachers played for laughs in this episode, despite leading to more poignant and sobering moments later on. And as I've already expressed, these bits with the Mustang unit are all designed to be played for laughs, in this case making for the funniest episode of either show by a country mile. Just like the wish fulfillment chapters, though, this all comes crashing down when you least expect it. It makes episode 9 into a real roller coaster of emotions in the best way, and I'm honestly pretty proud of the final result for that. And for those wishing the original message from these side stories was still intact in Brotherhood, some of it was translated into Hohenheim's Clip Show episode in stunning fashion. Some would say that I should wrap up here, that Rush Valley is better left to a video on Doubleth. And if we were talking about the official cut, I'd probably agree. However, due to a couple changes I made to this one, I think it's best we cover it now. With that in mind, let's hop into Miracle at Rush Valley. Due to the new ending for episode 9, the follow-up scene in the official cut of Separate Destinations was moved to the start of this episode. After Armstrong and Mustang discuss the current situation, we get a quick flash of the Elrics and Winry on the train before fading to the OP. This somewhat mirrors the setup used in the 2003 anime, albeit with Brotherhood footage instead. Instead, we kick off with a title card before jumping into the first OP scene of the 2003 episode, Her Reasons. This episode is infamously one of the weakest in either FMA adaptation for its borderline character assassination of Winry, but these first handful of scenes are straight from the manga and manage to go relatively unchanged from that incarnation. We only get this first scene, however, as Paninia's first appearance throws a wrench into further use of 2003 material. In order to include her in 2003's adaptation of the arm wrestling sequence, Paninia was given a metal arm in addition to her metal legs in that version specifically. Seeing as Brotherhood sticks with the manga's design and omits this, however, we're unable to use any 2003 scenes with her in it. This isn't to say we can't use the arm wrestling sequence at all, though. In fact, through some clever resequencing, we can cut Paninia's portion out altogether, leaving Ed to score the victory just a little sooner than he otherwise would. It also allows us to maintain the manga setup for the whole town being enamored with Ed's automail. that being how the onlookers from the arm wrestling match took notice of it. Brotherhood omitting this is one of the weirder choices on this part, as without this whole sequence it just sorta happens for no reason. In any case, this return to Brotherhood's take on the episode continues from here until Dominic's introduction. Again, 2003's design changes made doing anything else an impossibility, even if this chase through the town is otherwise more accurate to the manga. Dominic's introduction acts as the last 2003 scene of the episode, with this quick moment of Winry introducing herself and causing Dominic to have a conniption about Pinocchio, being a pretty funny bit that also just happens to be from the manga. Just like with Brotherhood's previous cut material regarding Rush Valley, I have no idea why this was removed given that there was spare time in the official cut. Once we cut back to Brotherhood with Dominic inspecting Ed's automail, we stay on track up to this line from Miss Riedel. Once again, this was done due to the lack of alternatives. I'm admittedly not super happy with Brotherhood's direction here, but this is a rare example where I can at least say it's better than what the other show managed. Back to the episode at hand, this change is what made me include this episode as part of the Lab 5 arc of FMABR. In the original cut, everyone goes ballistic after this line from Mrs. Riedel. It's played for laughs, and even if I'm not a big fan of Brotherhood's humor, I think that's totally fine. Seeing as I cut the creative memories plotline, however, I wanted to give concrete connection to Hughes' words in the previous episode. And since this episode is similarly Winry-centric, it seemed like a natural choice. I'm surprisingly happy with how it turned out, and I think it's a far better resolution to this setup than the manga ever managed. A notable omission from this act of the story, however, is the bridge scene. This infamously never made it into either show despite being a very well-liked snippet of the manga. Perhaps in the future, a bit of animation can fill in over top of Ed's monologue later in the episode, but it's a pretty lofty goal and makes for a pretty limited window of time to work with. Following the titular miracle at Rush Valley, though, the episode remains unchanged from its official cut, and therefore brings the Lab 5 arc of FMABR to a close. Beyond the play-by-play of these episodes' narrative structure, the overall takeaway from all of these episodes is an aspect of FMABR that I've already touched on. FMABR isn't a manga cut, and isn't afraid to use 2003 exclusive content or even go its own way altogether, as long as it suits the greater manga broho story. Manga accuracy be damned, these scenes with Maria Ross and Hughes are top tier and deserve to be here. And beyond what 2003 did, sometimes there's a story arc that just doesn't gel well with the rest of the series and remains contentious in the fanbase. The Creative Memories plotline is one such example, and manga accuracy be damned, this arc is better off without it. FMA 3R is a different story, but one for another time. This is normally where I'd go over the technical shenanigans, but I've decided to go in a different direction for those going forward. Instead of going through them bit by bit in a scripted fashion, I'm going to cover the editing work for every episode, even episodes 1 through 6, in a live stream after the narrative breakdowns are finished. This not only makes it easy to host a live Q&A at the same time, but also allows me to go into the process in more detail without needing to formalize everything in a script. Fun fact, this is also what happened to the Team 4-star episode breakdowns, for those familiar with them. I understand now, Kaiser. I understand. But with that, I think we're finally done with this installment. Next time, we'll cover the entire Doubleth arc. See you then.